So today we're just going to take in an explanation of the bill and take in some public testimony on the bill this afternoon. And then tomorrow we will reconvene at 3 o'clock, same time, same location, to vote to vote on the measure. So that's our posture for today and tomorrow. And we're waiting for the senator to arrive. There he is.
How you doing?
Good. Okay. Yeah, he's here. Mr. Vice Chair, how are you? Senator, we're not voting this one today. We just want you to explain. No. I want you to explain the bill. And you need a copy of it? That's a proposed sub. That's what I'm telling you. You want your bill. Yes, sir. And we'll take any testimony that people want to give. And we're going to vote tomorrow.
So all we're doing is hearing his mess.
We're here his bill. Vote on it tomorrow.
All right. What does your sub do differently?
I'll tell you that when we get. Let me tell you that when we get there.
I gotta go find Meadows. I've been.
Copy the bill.
I have been beckoned.
When you see him. So I'm going to explain again the posture that we're in today. Senator Gooch is going to present his bill to us today, and then we're going to listen to the testimony and take any testimony from the public. And then after that, we'll adjourn. I have given out to you just a proposed substitute. I've discussed some concepts with Ms. Munn. So but she has not had a chance. Neither has the senator had a chance to read these. So they will not be speaking to the substitute. So we'll hear from the author and then take testimony. And then tomorrow at the same time, same location, we'll vote out a measure. And you can choose at that time how you feel about it, but we'll vote at that time. So with that, there's a sign-up sheet. Brian has a sign-up sheet at the corner. Those that wish to speak on the measure, on the bill, will need to sign up there on the sign-up sheet, and we'll recognize you in a minute. So at this time, we'll have the senator present Senate Bill 366. Senator Gooch, good to have you here.
Thank you, President. Committee members, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about an important subject. Just this morning, we had another shooting up, I believe it was in Maryland, at a school where a young teenager was shot by a police officer. We have a real serious problem in our society, as you all know, and being a law enforcement officer is is a dangerous job. It's a dangerous occupation. And a couple years ago, we stepped up and took care of our state law enforcement officers here at the Capitol. And a lot of our local enforcement officers are experiencing some of the same problems that our state law enforcement officers were experiencing 2 years ago. And so we looked at that over a course of several months last year. The Senate put together a study committee, and we looked at several issues facing local law enforcement agencies. And we came up with several bills that we passed out of the Senate, and I believe there are 4, if I'm not mistaken. And SB 366 is an important part of that package that the Lieutenant Governor has supported and helped push through the Senate this year. I'll just give you a couple of stats and we'll move into the bill. In 2017, 128 law enforcement officers were killed in the line of duty. In 2018, this is through the month of February, there were already 17 killed in the line of duty. 9 were killed the first 2 weeks of February, and that's in the United States. If you compare that to the U.S. Armed Services, 33 members of our armed services were killed in action in 2017. That's 4 times as many law enforcement officers killed on American soil protecting our own communities. 6 of Georgia's law enforcement officers were killed in 2017, and last month, Officer Chase Maddox of the Locust Grove Police Department became the first killed in 2018. The average salary of a local law enforcement in Georgia is $40,770. The average starting pay for a deputy sheriff in Georgia is below $32,000. And that puts Georgia at 47th in the nation in pay for these local law enforcement officers. Retention rates are terrible. There are 150 unfilled vacancies for sheriff's departments and jailers across the state as of last month, and that does not include our police departments. And so some of the things that we looked at in this bill to help to move in the direction of trying to address that is to try to get local communities to do the right thing and pay their local law enforcement officers a competitive wage. We don't feel in the Senate, and I'm sure you share the same feelings, that the state should be paying this inequity in these areas. What we did find is there are many areas in Georgia where the pay is extremely low and much lower than others. So we looked at those areas, and we think that the lowest paid enforcement officers are in Tier 1 counties. So in the bill, you'll see a proposal that we set up a grant program for those Tier 1 communities to where local law enforcement officers, through their local governing authorities, would apply for this grant through a grant program that would be administered by the state. But before we start giving out state funds, we feel like the local law enforcement officers and the local governing authorities, whether it be a city or a county, do their own sort of their own internal needs assessment. So the bill requires that the cities and counties, along with the cooperation with the police chiefs and the sheriff's departments, do a study, a salary study that would be entered into the Department of Community Affairs database. The DCA would then turn around and put together adequate reports that would reflect what those communities are paying their law enforcement officers compared to counties and communities of similar size, demographics, population, so forth and so on. So then we would take those reports and we would put them back out into the public, give those cities and counties an opportunity to discuss them, also give the community an opportunity to see those, and allow the citizens of the community to either put pressure on the elected officials to help raise the pay of these salaries that are very low, or to say simply that we think they're adequate now. What are the other problems that would create a retention problem in our department? So I think that's a move in the right direction, and that summarizes the bill pretty quickly. There's several other parts of the bill. We'll get into the nuts and the bolts of it if you'd like.
That's a very thorough overview. Senator Gooch, you had said about the jailers and sheriffs, the unfilled vacancies. What was that number?
There were 150 at the time of this report. That was when I presented the bill in the Senate.
Okay.
I also have a couple maps I'll pass out. You can just pass them down, let your members take a look at them. It shows a colored map of the starting salaries of jailers and deputies. Irene, you want to pass those too?
And so let's while the map's being passed, let me just go through kind of the bill and break it down a little bit. The first section, or the first portion that deals with 3677-1 creates a definition section for the bill to operate under.
Correct.
in that, section 36-77-2 goes through and puts together or requires the submission of information to DCA, the Department of Community Affairs, that is based upon the actual wages, salaries that are paid by local governments, either the city or county. And then that information is to be transmitted to DCA. DCA is to compile that information to try to adjust it for demographics, for the, as it says in here, it says, let's see, and then I'm going by the study, and then this one here, there's a methodology that's supposed to resolve the agencies is supposed to take in similar size operation, labor markets, equity, comparables. That's on lines 41 through 43, 42, I'm sorry. And then also at 34, it's supposed to take in 35 as population statistics, geographical location data, social economic factors, demographics, and then of course the salaries that are paid to employees. From that, then the next step of this bill is to require each, once that's submitted, they have to, there's a deadline set by the bill in lines 46 through 51. And then I think the kicker here in lines 57 through the following page to 63 is the removal of a local government's qualified local government status, which then makes them ineligible for state funding, grants, loans. And so that's the real stick in the bill, to compel the submission of this information that's needed for DCA to compile it. Now, my understanding is that in the discussions and reading the COPS report that was done as the Senate report, that part of this was, and that was a point of that report also, to have that stick. With that being the case, it's important that it's expensive to go do a salary study. It can be for local governments, and if you're talking about being strapped already in terms of your salary, it doesn't move the ball forward if you're requiring each local government to do their salary study. So I think some of the compromise that was worked out in getting to this point was that DCA would be the warehouse for that information, and DCA, the state, essentially through DCA, would be responsible for trying to synthesize this information.
That's right.
So that shifted the cost burden for assisting local governments with their compensation and wages to the state and through the taxpayers of the state to try to help do this for the local governments, and then send that back out so that it becomes a public document, and that can be utilized by the public and their local jurisdictions to accomplish what Senator Gooch talked about before, which was be to adjust those salaries as it is necessary and as it's politically viable. Is that fair to say?
That is a very good description of the process. And again, nothing in this bill would require the counties or the cities to increase pay. It would simply require them to enter the data to DCA in order to create the studies and to provide the reports back to the communities. And then the communities would have to decide, is this something we want to do? Is it something we can afford to do? And if so, you know, here's some guidance, and we should adopt these new pay scales, and we should move in that direction. But there's no requirement in here that they be funded to those levels.
And then it also requires at lines 64 through 70, it gives, I think this was something that the local governments wanted to see, was that there was a time to cure, so that if the reports were not submitted, they could avoid losing their qualified local governmental status by curing that defect promptly.
Chairman Welch, let me, if I may add, this isn't the first time this has ever been done. This qualified local government status is something that we use a lot in local governments, as you are aware.
Yes.
I was a former commissioner. You were an attorney for the cities and counties, perhaps. This is something that we use routinely. If cities and counties do not perform certain acts, then they could jeopardize their QLG status. So this isn't something we just came up with.
No, that's true. That's true. It's used in other parts of the code.
That's right.
Section 36-77-3 of the bill sets forth a grant funding mechanism that would be administered by the Department of Community Affairs. And I do recognize that in your COPS report that there was a proposal or recommendation that the state appropriate a minimum of $7 million of state funds for these grant programs. So that's where that's coming from, out of that report. So I want to make sure we kind of summarize the bill, and if I've missed anything, let me know, Senator.
It looks like you've read the bill thoroughly.
Okay, well, thank you. I know our members have too, and they've got questions all over the board, so I'm going to let them start asking those questions. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of things for the record. Senator Gooch, thank you so much for bringing this, but I did want to let you know that I am in the minority here because I think the state has got to get involved in this, and for several reasons. But I'm just from Midway, and a duck's a duck. A grant program is state money, so we you know, we are involved when we start a grant. And I look at this map. Democratic caucus conducted hearings all over the state last year. Last one down in Liberty County, we had over 225 people present. And when I look at this map, everything south of Houston County is orange or blue. And I can tell you now, the pay in Macon County for a jailer is less than $16,000. It's about $15,600.
Yes, sir.
And all I'm saying is, I'm going to support anything that helps, but I don't like kicking the proverbial can down the road. Because I got to tell Joe Sixpack, who might be making $10 an hour in Atkinson County, that once again we ain't got nothing but a study. And my thing is that we can't love law enforcement and send them kisses. Boys can't take that to J.C. Penney's or Kmart and the ladies. And all I'm saying is, and I'm stressing that yes, I think, because we just spent millions of dollars to help rural Georgia, because they ain't got no blood in the turnip. We can study this all we want, but people can't pay what they ain't got. If the state does not get in it, there ain't nobody gonna have no money. So we move a person from $15,000 to $18,000, we can't have a parade, because he still ain't making a livable wage. And all I'm saying is, at some point, we're gonna have to deal with it, because counties ain't got the money. If those counties that got the money are paying livable wages.
Yes, sir.
Those that ain't got it ain't got it. And no matter what we study, we're not gonna change the per capita income of the majority of rural counties, not only south of Houston County, but in some of those yellow spots in North Georgia. It is, sometimes we're gonna have to answer, where is the beef?
Show me the money. I appreciate the comments. Let me remind you about Tier 1 counties. The map that you saw shows, I think you saw the Tier 1 map. Did you get it? No, this is a Tier 1 map here. You don't have it. We can pass it down too. There's 71 counties out of 159 that are designated by DCA as Tier 1 counties. A Tier 1 county are the counties that have the highest unemployment rates for the most recent 36-month period. They have the lowest per capita income for the most recent 36-month period, and they have the highest percentage of residents whose incomes are below the poverty level according to the most recent data available. So these are the poorest counties in our state, and they do need the most help. And obviously, your work with in the rural study committees that you all did in the House last year are very important. And I saw some of the work that you put into the budget this year for that. This is part of that package as well, but it's an important part of law enforcement compensation throughout the state. And we can start with the studies this year. This law requires these studies to be in by the end of 2018. So we can immediately begin seeing some attention being given to this as early as next summer. And so we do have some money in this year's budget. The Senate put $3 million in the budget as more or less as a primer. We would love to see that number increase as monies are available.
Thank you. Our chairman from Liberty County.
I just want to go to Rick and how I feel.
I was a little confused, though. I think you might have muddied the waters on that. Do you want to try again?
Yeah, I was very gentle. I was hoping that.
Well, but to the
wait till I talk again.
to the point of to the point of Senator Gooch, you had mentioned that you felt like, and I assume the Senate agrees with this sentiment since the bill is here, that the funding does need to come locally. This is a local funding issue, and that but to Representative Williams' point, and to your point as well, is that we understand and recognize that there are areas, and there are, of our state, a significant number of counties that lack the ad valorem resources to pay for the same salaries as other locales would have. That tax-based discrepancy exists and cannot be addressed per this bill. But what you're doing is shining a light where it may need to be given some light with this legislation. And then secondarily, I mean, the only, one thing that this bill does not consider, but since Representative Williams has brought up a bigger picture item, I wonder if there shouldn't be some dialogue about whether or not some counties should consider some consolidation with other counties to lower the administrative cost and the overall cost of law enforcement within those geographic areas that have populations, let's say, of 5,000 or less. And in that way, you'd have a little bit more economy of size to deal with those salaries. But just a thought, since Representative Williams had.
That would be a great discussion to have someday, but we also, already have multiple jurisdictional law enforcement agencies in our state. Drug task forces
That's right.
are one
We
example of that. So we're doing some of that already, but I would encourage any local government to look at ways to reducing their overhead and try to create some efficiencies and economies of scale in the future.
The Representative.
Mr. Chairman, if I can add to
Yes.
that, our bill definitely addresses, if you look at 93 through 95, we were attempting to think about that there had to be a demonstrated need. Not only you're in tier 1, but you also have a financial need, but you've also done locally everything you need to do to consolidate funding, to contract services, to do that cooperation. And as our thought process went, there's just a reality to the fact that we have 159 counties. They are political subdivisions of our state. Sheriffs are constitutional officers that are respected by our Constitution, and they have a role to play that it cannot be done away with. And so the reality of the partnership that the state has with those constitutional officers, especially when they have a lack of funding at the local level, we need them. The state needs those offices to be operational, and those citizens deserve the same sort of public safety as any citizen in the state of Georgia. So there's that reality that the state does have a need to partner with those low-wealth districts. No different than the conversations that the House has been having over what is the state's relationship, what does that partnership look like, especially when you have the constitutional office of sheriff.
Good points. Representative Gravely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing the measure. I see this firsthand daily. I'm retained monthly by a public safety uniform company, and it is a cutthroat business. And we have offices and agencies or departments that have a very, very healthy stipend for their deputies or their officers. And then we have some that say you can get a pair of shoes or boots for the year, and if you wear them out, you're on your own. And so I've seen that up close and personal. But in Douglas County, which is where I live in Douglasville, we did a salary study because if you know, Terry probably knows this, and anybody else in law enforcement, if you live near Cobb County, you can mandate, you can certify an officer or deputy, and they'll spend about 2 to 3 years with you. And when Sheriff Neil Warren, God bless him, I grew up in that county, love him to death, but when he does a job posting, our folks in Douglas and Paulding, they all leave because they're going over to Cobb County. We did a salary study for our local PD in Douglasville, and it was a financial burden. I mean, it was highly contested, but we needed to do it. To find out how we were comparing with some other regions, and they did it. And so my understanding here is that what we're going to do is we will appropriate funds for this, for a 159 county salary study
And cities.
and cities. So the municipalities and the counties to determine the scale, the margin or whatnot across the state
On a regional basis.
on a regional basis.
Right.
Okay. My next question would be, the 150, is that just jailers
Post-certified law enforcement officials,
that were lacking, correct?
deputies and jailers, that's correct.
And I was actually kind of surprised. I thought that number would be a lot higher. I think even in one of my counties, we've got 18 open
that right?
positions that we can't fill simply because we can't make the budget.
That number was based on the responses we
Okay, okay.
received, so there could be more.
Okay, that was and that was 150. Tell me that again, I missed it, 150
Deputies and jailers,
deputies
Unfilled
and
Current
vacancies.
open
Post-cert.
positions.
Unfilled.
but they're
And
unfilled.
maybe, is that right?
Would you say that's low, Terry?
That's way low.
Yes.
Okay.
I think they left a zero on because it's 1,500 plus
Okay.
jailers and deputies. Excuse me, Senator Goose, not.
No, I'm glad you stepped up there.
Yeah.
Which would beg for the need more to find out how we would need to fix it,
No
correct?
matter what, the issue that the COPS Task Force looked at is well beyond, the urgency is not just the
Absolutely.
compensation. The urgency is that we don't have folks going into law enforcement.
Yeah,
And so, and that is having a huge detrimental effect to local communities when they don't have adequate police protection, as you well know.
absolutely.
That's the number one duty of government, is to provide public safety.
It is, and I think it would be, as we move forward and talk about this bill, I think there are some municipalities and some counties that would love to do a salary study. They simply just can't afford to do it. And we've lost quite a bit in my area to some larger regions that were able, for instance, gentleman one of my sheriffs called me one night and said, I've lost my right arm. And I thought, oh God, what's happened, you know? He said, well, my PIO, who would have probably ended up being the sheriff one day, took a job, went from the sheriff's office to a police department in about 4 counties over. And after looking at the mileage traveled back and forth, looking at the benefits, took a demotion to go to this police department, was still making $15,000 more a year, as opposed to having stayed home in the county where he had grown up and been his entire law enforcement career. So I look forward to levying into this measure and seeing what we can do. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Representative. And Chairman Caldwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, I'm looking specifically at line 82 of your bill, and it talks about the local governments to make application for grant funds for local law enforcement compensation. My question is that if a county or whomever makes the application and they receive grant funds to increase the compensation of their law enforcement, what happens when the grant runs out or they don't get the grant the next year, or if there's not funds in the grant? Then isn't the county or the city going to be then obligated to continue paying that salary because they were already paying it because they received a grant?
Yes, sir, and that's pretty consistent with any other grant that you get. Even if you recall, some of you may be familiar with the COPS grants during the Clinton administration. I was a county commissioner back 18 years ago, and we would get those COPS grants. And one of the stipulations at that time was when you were using that federal money, you would hire those police officers and you would use that grant money for up to 3 years or more. And then after that grant money runs out, then at that time you were on your own to pay that. So now the local governments could just discontinue to pay that stipend if they choose to. But
That was my
I would
point.
hope they would not if they're trying to retain good officers and they can use some of this money in these tier 1 counties, then I think that helps to recruit good people and helps them to retain them as well. Hopefully within 3 years or 2 years or whatever time frame that is, then the budgets would allow them to keep that funding at that level going forward.
Well, I understand, but I would just say, my point was though, if the grant ran out and the county was in the same situation it's in when they applied for the grant,
Right.
then they're right back to where they were.
It's a commitment. I mean, at some
Right.
point, the government, we're gonna have to take care of our employees, just like we did with the state patrolmen. the counties and the cities are gonna have to take care of their employees as well. And some of them are gonna struggle with low tax digest, that's an issue. But I think this is a help, it's a step in the right direction.
I agree with that.
Thank you.
All right, Chairman Ballinger.
You just used the term "our employees," and I believe that, you know, sheriffs are constitutional officers and they operate autonomously. So you know, whenever, as somebody who was paid by a grant, VOCA, once upon a time, there are a lot of strings that come with grants. Can you elaborate on what kind of you know, what kind of controls and what kind of reporting and what kind of burden that's going to put on our local law enforcement?
It will require some, but if you look at line 80, the Department of Community Affairs shall promulgate rules and regulations which shall provide standards and procedures for those grants.
Yeah.
So those are standard procedures. I've done dozens, if not hundreds, of grants in my lifetime, and there are reporting requirements and there's auditing requirements to make sure the money is being used as appropriately set aside. So we would want that accountability to be in place, not only for us, but also for the locals that would receive that funding.
So you don't know what kind of reporting
I can't tell you because we're allowing DCA to set those rules in place.
All right.
So we don't want to get into the weeds of how that particular grant would be awarded. We want DCA to help get that feedback from the locals. So you would have cities, you'd have counties, you would have police chiefs and sheriff's department personnel engaged in those rule setting requirements. So they would set up a proposed rule for that grant program. They would publicize it and advertise it for so many days. They would receive feedback, and then DCA would adopt those rules and regulations pertaining to that particular grant program.
But it appears to me that the grant portion of this bill is intended to be a very broad brush to allow whatever monies is awarded through the grant to be used for nearly anything that the local government deems appropriate relative to wages and salaries.
Correct. Only for wages and salaries in those tier 1 counties that apply.
Other questions? Okay. No, it's working. When you turn it on.
Just hit it once. The light, well, on the light
Nate, you're good.
don't work. So just hit it once.
Just grab the other mic then. Grab the other mic. There we go.
Senator, this is just sort of a random question, I guess. Sitting here looking at, this is based on deputy starting salaries and things of that nature or whatever. Did you guys do any looking at all at school resource officers?
We didn't look specifically at them, but most of the school resource officers are an employee of the sheriff's department. So
Right.
they would come under this
They would
study as well.
come under this. I was
Yes.
just wondering if we had a comparison about where school resource officers stand. I know some of them are employed by school boards, whatever, but where the resource officers stand in comparison to like starting deputies or whatever.
Yeah, I think it would vary because of seniority and rank and so forth. But most of your SROs in my district are an employee of the sheriff's department. The school boards either pay part of the salary or reimburse
Or
the county.
supplement, yeah.
That's right. So most of them are run through the sheriff or the local
And
police chief.
part of our problem for the COPS task force was that we really didn't have good data. We were taking volunteer surveys from the Sheriff's Association, the county commissioners, as it relates to not only compensation, but benefits, retirement, the whole 9 yards. So again, this is the opportunity to have good, solid information across the board to help inform not only local governments as it relates to what they're paying, but also the state as a whole. What discrepancies are we really having out there? And then that would also very much help inform how much of a state's commitment, if they choose to invest through this grant program, what are we talking about on the type of money that's out there that needs in order for all of our citizens to have the type of adequate sheriff's office or police protection that they deserve?
So it's basically you just starting from scratch.
Pretty much, we didn't feel comfortable, and maybe again, our cities and counties might come up and talk about, they very much were involved in our task force, but we didn't find, other than Department of Labor data, already reporting to DCA, but it's not required, so it was voluntary and incomplete. It just was not as good as we had hoped it to be, to go not only entry level, but the whole department and what that looks
Which
like.
is why we
Basically,
need this.
Basically, you're saying that y'all were a little bit uncomfortable with some of the stuff you were seeing.
Well, we need verification. That's why we're asking for the surveys and the data to be entered into the database at DCA so we can get good reports. Next year, we can give you as much information as you want.
Yeah.
After this information comes through at the end of this year, we may look at it and say, man, we really do have a bigger problem than we
Right.
thought.
And that's what I was going, no one thought that officers were being overpaid.
Right, right.
So, Senator Gooch, do we, because this is gonna require, the attention of the Department of Community Affairs, do we have a fiscal note for the cost of doing the survey?
We worked with the department, they're aware of the bill, and the Senate did put money in the budget of DCA to stand up, I keep calling it a dashboard, Mr. Chairman, about this, this, so, I think
And
it's a-
when you're referring to dashboard, just so everybody hears that, North Carolina has a water and sewerage rate study that they do. North Carolina does it, and they do it all over the Southeast, and they call it a dashboard, and it's a visual image of what the rates are for various geographic areas, so they can see what their rates are. But going back to your statement about the DCA money, how much did the Senate put in?
We put $3 million in for the grants. I believe we have $150,000 in for the administrative cost. But some of this reporting is already being done by local governments. This would emphasize the reporting requirements for DCA to take that data now and then cut out some regional comparisons to help the locals to come up with a pay scale. So that's the extra work requirements of DCA in the bill. Some of the data is already being entered, but we're not getting it back from them. This will require them to go to the next step and produce the reports and do a more of a regional comparison.
So make sure I got that right. It was $150,000 to DCA for the collection. Was that a one person or just a set amount?
Set amount.
Okay.
Just to let them make that discretionary call. We hope they have enough personnel already on board to do the work. They may have to bring in some additional resources to help them.
Okay. Other questions for members of the committee? If not, we'll move on to taking other guest speakers.
Thank you.
All right. I know some of you have to run. We have just two people that are going to speak today. Deborah Nesbitt from ACCG and Terry Norris from the Sheriff's Association will be here to speak to us.
You want me here or up there?
Podium will be fine, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate you letting us be here today. As Senator Gooch and Ms. Munn indicated, we were greatly involved in this over the summer and through the fall in collecting all of this data. And we think getting more data and more accurate data is exactly something that we need to do and that will help us in determining where those resources are needed. The only heartburn that really our folks had was the qualified local government status, and Senator Gooch is aware of that, and he's aware of why. But I think some of the suggestions in your amendments may help soften that somewhat. But it still would impact that local government qualified status, and I think that may be one of the things the cities were concerned about as well. But I do appreciate them working with us to now have the DCA to do the actual study. That's going to relieve a great burden off of local governments. And we believe that having that consistent data across the state to be a part of that study is going to benefit everybody. We're going to get better information and better data than if we had every jurisdiction going out and hiring a company to do that compensation study. So I think we're going to have a better statewide picture of how things really are. So with that, I know it's been a long day for everybody. I know it's been a long day for me and many of you sitting up there also. So if anybody has any questions for me, that would be all. And Justin, here, is there anything you want to add?
Well, before you go, Ms. Deborah, let me ask a question. There are several items in the COPS study that are designated for GMA and ACCG to work on. There's probably six items in that list. How are things? What steps are being taken to try to fulfill some of those items?
We haven't done anything yet. The COPS study report came out in December, and obviously the session started. And so I imagine that we'll be looking at that once the legislative session is over, based on what passes and what's signed into law and what we can actually do in some of those areas.
Did you have a question for Ms. Nesbitt? Okay.
Thank you. I was just noticing, and what I wanted to state was that though we didn't have attendance from your organization during our hearings, we had county commissioners at each one of our hearings, and the one thing we stressed was that county government would not be asked, could not be asked, to put money in this kitty, because we understood the situation. One of the things that bothers me is when I look at this, I've got some counties that are tier 4 counties until it gets over to the pay at the jail. Then they pay like they are tier 2 counties. You know, they out of whack there. Now I can understand, pay study there, these folk need to ante up. But the average county in here, they pretty well doing what they do, and the difference, my hearings were out in the field. Folk walked in their boots right out of their patrol cars. And it's tough to hear a jailer talk about making $16,000, $17,000 a year and feeding a family, single. And the county government money is not there. I hope the pay study certainly looks at counties, how they're painted on these pictures and how they're painted when it comes time to pay. Then
I
we can get
understand.
something out.
And I would also like to say that, you know, the sheriffs came to one of our fall meetings a couple of years ago and spoke to our membership. And from that time forward, most counties stepped up and gave their law enforcement some type of raise. And some of them have given multiple raises. Some could only give a small raise. But I think that our membership, our county commissioners recognize that law enforcement needs to be paid. And I think that most of them have stepped up and tried to do what they could do within the resources they had available. So they are aware of it, and they are listening, and they are participating. And so we look forward to getting better data so we can look at some potential solutions.
Right. Did GMA want to say anything for?
Just wanted to piggyback off of what Deborah stated, and that we did definitely appreciate working with Senator Gooch and Ms. Munn and the rest of the COPS task force during the course of the study. And we want, same as the ACCG, had a little heartburn with the qualified local government status. However, this bill in the form was far better. The fact that all of that stuff goes through DCA as opposed to hiring an outside firm, which was going to be extremely expensive for a lot of our local government. So we are very thankful for the work that we were able to do on this. And we, to the point Deborah made, as far as the other points that were in the COPS, that we are going to be addressing those as soon as we get out of session. We're going to form some type of committee within GMA so we can start looking at all of that stuff so we can reach all this stuff. This is the beginning of the conversation, and that's what was stated during the COPS task force, and we would like to continue that conversation and work towards solutions for our law enforcement.
Well, I can just tell you, I think that several of the members of this committee will constantly be asking that question. Mr. Norris, you would like to join us?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Come on up.
Thank you very much. There's an awful lot I could say. I'll condense it. I want to say thank you to Senator Gooch for this measure and the other three that came through from the COPS task force. Representative Williams, thank you for the series of meetings this summer. We learned a lot through those conversations as well. Folks, we're dying on the vine out there. We are 1,500 short on the sheriff's side, jailers and deputies. We don't know how many police officers are short throughout the state. I am here, y'all all know me as the representative of the sheriffs. I'm the executive director of the Sheriff's Association and the youth homes and the retirement fund and the foundation. So we have a lot of hats we wear. You all know me from the law enforcement side, and I appreciate that. Every 911 call in this state is answered by a deputy sheriff or a police officer, every one of them. State officers are excellent. We need them. They're a great support. They have resources. The raise that Governor Deal authorized or recommended that you all funded over the past 2 years are warranted. They're supported by the sheriffs. We needed to do that. It did show, though, a glaring deficiency
and what we're paying to local officers. The sheriffs came into this conversation not just last year, but several years ago. We've long recognized the low pay. Deputy sheriffs now, so by our numbers, are about 31 and some change starting. Jailers are about just over 26. And that's the average starting. That means some of our jailers are making, Representative Williams, $9.50 an hour. Hardest job to fill we have as a jailer. I have 143 jails. We've got 39,000 plus inmates in county jails. It's a very difficult job to perform. We can't hire people. We can't pay them. 2016, of all deaths, there was 9 in the state, 7 were local officers. And there's a reason for that. I mean, local officers far outnumber state officers. They are answering all the 911 calls. So they're routinely more exposed to danger than most everybody else. But those are the people, for the most part, that are losing lives in our state. We wholeheartedly support this bill, as I mentioned. And we do think this. We came to this conversation last session talking about all local officers, and we still feel that way. We want to see, the goal is to get local officers, local police officers, local deputy sheriffs, paid at levels equal to what we pay our beginning state troopers, for example. We want our jailers to be paid equal to what our corrections officers are paid. There is probably not a more dangerous job in this state than being a jailer or a state corrections officer. It is, y'all, I can't even begin to describe. I can't even understand. I go there, I see it, but I don't work in that environment. So what you're doing today by talking about this bill and the previous other 3 bills is vitally important. From the sheriff's perspective, and it was touched on earlier, I do represent the people who hold the office of sheriff, but I am a real fundamentalist. I didn't have to be taught this. I've always known this. I've always respected the office of sheriff. It came in my upbringing. I've always recognized the office of sheriff is not better than anybody else, any other local or state law enforcement entity, but it's different. It's different because throughout the history of our state, governors and legislatures have placed responsibilities, state responsibilities, on sheriff's offices. And there has virtually, in my 23 years, I've never seen not one corresponding dollar to a county to be appropriated to a sheriff's office to perform any function that is passed into law. There are many mandates. Sheriffs are, by court decision, federal court decision, deemed locally elected agents of the state. So we can't say that about police departments and police officers, but we can say that about sheriffs and deputy sheriffs. Deputy sheriffs and jailers perform the functions that you all in your throughout the history of the state, the legislature has told them to do, and the governors have agreed. So when we come to you and we say, we're looking for a state solution to this funding, the statewide funding solution, we say that because we believe there is basis. We don't just think it's a local matter. Again, we're performing, our people are performing the things that you all told us to do. And I truly believe that, you know, I want to kind of hang around about 5 more years. And I truly believe in the next 5 years that you all will find a solution to this problem. Because if we don't, we're not going to have a safe state. We're not going to have a state that people want to come to raise their families, start businesses, et cetera. So I appreciate what you're doing today, and I appreciate the opportunity to make these few comments. And I know in my heart that you all feel the same way that we do. So any questions, Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
You have some questions. Representative Gravely.
Thank you, Terry, for your presentation. Could you tell us, everybody may know, may not know, I'm not sure. I know I have a full service sheriff's office in Paulding County and Douglas County. And I know when populations get a little bit bigger, you maybe have a county PD or city PD kind of takes over some of those duties, and it goes to just warrants in the jail. Do we know now how many full-service sheriff's offices we have, as opposed to those who have gone to more or less just handling the the jails and warrants in the state?
Well, I would say that even those that have county police departments, and there's about 13 in the state. There used to be a lot more. In the early 1990s, this legislature passed legislation that said if a county wanted a county police department, they had to have a referendum before qualified voters of the county. Since that time, there have been 6 attempts that I can remember. In my 23 years, there have been 6 attempts to create county police departments. And all of those attempts have failed through the referendum, failed in a big way. So there's about 13 now. There's about 3,400 counties in the United States, give or take, and there's a little over 100 counties with county police departments.
But in Georgia, and you may need to get that data, I'm not sure if you know it off the top of your head, will you know how many full-service sheriff's offices we still have
Well,
operating?
13 less, 159 less 13, what's that?
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed that number.
Yeah.
You got it. Thank
And
you.
that 13 number, it's a little bit of a soft number because there's a couple of counties out there that actually have a county police department on the books, but they don't really they don't fund it, so.
Gotcha.
Or they barely fund it.
Thank you.
You want to ask a question? All right. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't on Chairman Powell's committee, so I have a little more energy than some of his committee members. He works them so hard. But one of the things that I wanted to say, and I dropped a bill on deputy sheriff's compensation this year. I knew it would be tough to get it through, but I did think it would get a hearing. It didn't. But it had a base pay of $33,500 for deputy sheriffs in Georgia, something to build on, headed toward parity with state. Had $33,500. I thought it deserved at least a hearing. The thing is that through my unscientific data, about 110 of 159 sheriffs in Georgia have signed up in support of Republican candidates for governor. So, politically the benefit is minimal for me. But overall, I thought that these sheriffs and these deputies deserve to at least have their case heard by the legislature, and then go home to your legislators, and they can very proudly say, here's why I didn't support it, or here's why I supported it. That was my only contention. And I continue and will continue to drop that same bill in every session, that we have a minimum pay supplemented by state funds, because when we show up all over this state when a deputy dies, we cry, we stand to our feet, and we pray. I just want them to be able to have a good life while they're standing and living.
Thank you, Representative.
Other questions for Mr. Norris? Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. So that's all the public comments we have at this point. So we'll close the public comment session of the hearing. And then what I'd like to do is just go over with you the language that I proposed for a substitute from the committee. As you know, we did not appropriate any money in the budget on the House side for the grant program. This legislation here and the substitute that you have before you mirrors exactly what Senator Gooch's bill has proposed. It adds more specificity because the underlying bill speaks to all employees that work in a sheriff's office or a police department. Yet what we've talked about when we've given pay raises or we've dealt with salaries, we have focused on those that are certified law enforcement. So this measure actually includes definitions of a jail officer, a peace officer, and a candidate, someone that is in the process of training, been hired, but not yet certified. So in doing that, the substitute focuses down onto those law enforcement personnel and not just the entire employment staff and administrative staff of the office. So that focuses the information, which then also cuts back on the cost of implementing the bill, because you're not asking for all the administrative staff salaries, you're just looking at the law enforcement. The other item of this that the substitute does is it changes this from being a salary survey, because that connotes that you are surveying the surrounding jurisdictions for salaries. And what we're really asking them to do is provide to us, to DCA, the compensation report. So the definition has been changed from a survey to a compensation report in the substitute. And then going through this, you'll see in the substitute as you read it tonight, that the second section of this, after you get to the definitions, goes through and sets forth the requirements that every law enforcement agency will have to produce this compensation report to DCA. DCA is charged with actually putting together the form, and so that the form and the information is presented the same way to DCA. That would streamline the process. In addition to that, it does require deadlines. It sets deadlines similar to Senator Gooch's bill. And then it also goes through and specifies a little bit more about what the commissioner's role is and the mandates that are placed on the commissioner. One is to collect those reports from the local law enforcement, and then number two is to publish it. So those are squarely placed on the commissioner to do that. The department is then charged with actually trying to pull that information together and make sense of it. So if you'll look at page 2 of the substitute, under the paragraph that is numbered B2, you'll see that the department is to produce a local law enforcement compensation guidance report. And this would be for each region of the state, which is consistent with Senator Gooch's bill. The report shall provide guidance to local governing authorities within each region as to the compensation and benefits of similarly situated law enforcement agencies. It should be noted that this substitute includes benefits when analyzing compensation, which is not contained or defined within Senator Gooch's bill. The department shall also establish by rule a methodology to synthesize and make rational the compensation reports of comparable and similarly situated law enforcement agencies within the region. Not every sheriff's department is the same. And especially at border regions, you'll see where their compensations may be higher because they're closer to a metropolitan area than others. Same with the city, with local city PDs. So that we need to rationalize that information and make them apples to apples comparisons. And then I noted in here that the methodology should take into consideration population, ratios of peace officers to population, which is a uniform method that even the FBI uses for law enforcement purposes to determine whether or not there's adequate protection, is a ratio of population to law enforcement or sworn officers. Crime statistics, assessed ad valorem property tax base, employment statistics, median incomes, service areas, inmate populations, and other socioeconomic factors. These factors, I think, are more closely honed to the nature of law enforcement and the roles that they play. It also takes into consideration the actual revenue sources that each of the counties would have through their ad valorem tax base. So those are some more defined factors for them to consider. The rest of the bill kind of follows along with what Senator Gooch's bill says, but those were the key points that I wanted to make sure were different in what's been addressed in the substitute. And again, this is for you to look at. I want you to consider it. This substitute does not include the grant portion of the bill, just to be clear.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask one thing for clarification on your new 2, where you're talking about the comparison?
We're outside the
Okay.
public hearing
Okay.
section. I'm explaining this to the bill,
Sure.
and then if they've got any questions for me regarding the substitute, we'll take those up. Are there any questions from members of the committee? If you'll look that over, we'll get this put into a form, and I'm going to work with the senator because he's just now received the language. I'll work with Ms. Munn as well to try to answer her questions regarding that substitute. And then what I'm intending to do is to have for you one that's drafted up by Ledge Council to make it conform to our standard code language that we use. But if you have any questions or concerns, this has been emailed to you for your review digitally if you wish. I've also had Ms. Pamela Lewis send to you the COPS report, the sheriff's own study that they've done. All the members of the committee will receive that as well by email, as well as ACCG's report. So you should have all those digitally for your consideration and review before we take a final decision on this bill.
So the sheriff's and the ACCG you haven't received it yet?
You should have received it by email, and if you have not, then I have copies at my office. Okay, and those will be going out, if they haven't, she's supposed to have sent them to you while we were here in the meeting. So you should have those for your review. I was expecting the presenters to bring their information as opposed to me being their messenger. So anyway, we're forwarding those on. So I'm gonna, that's a good question. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for your time today. We'll stand adjourned and I will get with the senator. Thank you.